What would you do if you finally found the courage to push away the most dangerous man in the city, whispered the ugliest sentence you had ever carried, that you were too big for someone like him, and instead of letting you go, he backed you gently against the wall, braced one scarred hand beside your head, and murmured two words that undid 20 years of shame. Try me. She had said it to save herself. She had said it the way you press on a bruise, first and hardest, so that no one else can. And the ruthless man who had every beautiful woman on the coast competing for a glance did not flinch, did not laugh, did not politely agree. He closed the distance instead, and looked at her as though she were the only thing in the world worth looking at, and made her a promise with 2 syllables. This is a story of hidden worth, of a woman taught to apologize for existing, and of the man who decided that everyone who had ever made her doubt herself was going to answer for it. Thea Brennan had spent 29 years learning to make herself smaller. She was soft and generously curved, with a warm face and careful hands, and a voice that trailed off at the end of sentences. And she had built her life inside the smallest possible footprint. She wore dark clothes that swallowed her shape. She sat at the ends of tables. She said sorry when other people bumped into her. It had been taught to her patiently and thoroughly, first by a mother who sighed at photographs, then by a school full of children who found her an easy target, and finally, most efficiently, by a man named Corin who had dated her for 2 years in careful secrecy and never once introduced her to a single friend, and who had told her, on the night he ended it, that he had never been able to imagine walking into a room with her on his arm. Thea had believed all of them. That was the part that had done the real damage, not the cruelty itself, but the slow conversion of it into fact, until she genuinely believed she was a thing that men might want in private and would never choose in public. What none of those people knew was what lived behind that folded-away exterior. Because Thea Brennan had a gift so rare that only a handful of people on the continent shared it. She was a fine art restorer and authenticator, and she could look at a canvas and see its whole life, the false kerkalier, the wrong century of white, the brushstroke that hesitated where the master's hand never would. Museums flew her in quietly. Auction houses paid for her silence. She had killed a 9-figure sale with a single sentence. She had an eye that could not be fooled, and a memory that forgot nothing, and she had spent her career being introduced as the technician, the quiet one, the woman in the back who does the actual work. And on the night everything changed, she was in the back of a very dangerous man's private gallery, doing exactly that, with no idea that the man himself had been standing in the doorway watching her for a very long time. Roman Draghi was the reason rooms had temperatures. He was tall and broad, and dressed in a charcoal suit cut with lethal precision, the head of a syndicate that owned the ports and the freight lines and the fear of every powerful family for 100 miles, a man rumored to end a life with a single unhurried nod. He rarely raised his voice. He never had to. He had inherited a fortune in art from his father along with the empire, and he had hired the best authenticator in the country to catalog it, and when Thea Brennan had arrived at his fortress above the water with her loupe and her sensible shoes and her habit of apologizing to furniture, his men had made the mistake of laughing about her in the corridor. Roman had not laughed. Roman had stood in the doorway of that gallery for the better part of an hour, unnoticed, and watched a soft woman in a shapeless cardigan lean over a canvas and go absolutely still the way a predator goes still, and then reach for her lamp and change the angle and say quietly, and something in the coldest man on the coast had come alive. She was extraordinary. He watched her work for 3 weeks and could not stop. She hummed when she was concentrating. She talked to the paintings, scolding them affectionately. She had a way of tilting her head that meant she had caught something. And Roman Draghi found himself inventing reasons to be in that wing of the house. And slowly, without ever intending it, he began to notice other things. He noticed she never let anyone stand behind her. He noticed she apologized before she disagreed, and that when she did disagree, she was always right. He noticed she ate lunch alone in a storeroom rather than in the kitchen with his men, and when he asked her why, she went red and said something about not wanting to be in the way, and Roman had gone very quiet because he had begun to understand what had been done to her. He had spent his life surrounded by beautiful, calculating women who wanted his name and his money and never once looked at him without pricing him. And here was a woman who did not want a single thing from him, who did not even seem to know she was allowed to want, and he was so completely undone by her that he could barely remember what he had walked into the room to do. She had no idea. That was the maddening thing. She was the only person in that house who did not know. The night it broke open, there was a storm rolling in off the water, and the gallery lamps were the only lights on in that wing. Thea had stayed late over a small, dark portrait that had been bothering her for days, and when she finally straightened, rubbing her neck, Roman was standing closer than she expected, close enough that she caught cedar and tobacco and something darker underneath, and her breath went out of her all at once. He had brought her a glass of amber whiskey, which he set down on the work table without a word, and he did not step back. Thea's heart began to hammer, because he had been doing this for weeks now. This quiet orbiting, this way of watching her, that made her feel, for the first time in her life, like something worth watching, and she had spent every one of those weeks lying awake telling herself she was imagining it. Men like Roman Draghi did not look at women like her. Everyone knew that. It was practically a law of physics. "Mr. Draghi," she said, and her voice came out wrong. "Roman," he corrected quietly. He did not move. "Thea, you have called me Mr. Draghi for 3 weeks while looking at me exactly the way I look at you, and I am running out of patience with both of us." And the fear came up in her so fast and so hard that she did the thing she always did. She flinched first, to get it over with. She put her hand flat against his chest and pushed, and he let her, and she stepped back into the wall and said, the ugliest sentence she had ever carried, the one she had rehearsed in 100 bathrooms, and never once said aloud. "Don't," she whispered. "Please. I know how this goes. I'm too big for someone like you." And the whole world seemed to stop. Roman Draghi did not laugh. He did not offer her a kindness, or a platitude, or that soft, embarrassed noise people made when she said the quiet part out loud. Something moved across his face instead. Something that looked less like desire, and more like fury, though not at her. Never at her. And he stepped forward, and he did not touch her at all. He simply braced one scarred hand against the wall beside her head, and lowered his own until they were eye to eye, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, close enough that she had nowhere left to look but at him. He was not caging her. She understood distantly that if she moved, he would step aside instantly. But she did not move. "Say that again," he said softly. Thea's throat closed. "I said I'm too big for," and he shook his head once, slowly. His eyes moved over her face, her mouth, the flush climbing her throat, and every place they landed felt like being touched. "Try me," Roman murmured. 2 words. Just 2 and 20 years of carefully constructed shame cracked straight down the middle. "Do you think I have not noticed you?" he said, his voice low and rough. "Do you think I have spent 3 weeks standing in that doorway because of the paintings?" "What?" He let his gaze travel down, unhurried and unapologetic, then back up to her eyes, and there was nothing polite in it, nothing pitying, only a hunger so plain and so patient that Thea's knees went unsteady. "I have been surrounded by starved, calculating women for 15 years, he said. "Every one of them wanted something. You have never once asked me for anything, and you talk to paintings, and you are the most beautiful thing that has ever walked into my house, and some coward taught you to say that sentence to men before they could say it to you." He leaned in and stopped. Tell me his name. And Thea, shaking, whispered, Why? Because I want to know who to ruin, Roman said. It was not a joke. She could hear that it was not a joke. And Thea Brennan, who had spent her entire life being wanted in secret and chosen by no one, put her trembling hand on the lapel of the most dangerous man on the coast and did not push him away a second time. Outside, the storm broke. But there was something Thea did not know. Something moving in the dark corridors of that house, because a man had been watching Roman Draghi fall and had understood exactly what it meant. Everything changed after that night, and almost none of it the way Thea expected. She kept waiting for the retreat, the cooling, the quiet reappearance of the distance man always restored once the moment had passed. It never came. Roman did the opposite. He took her out into restaurants where the whole room turned into the opera, into a charity gala thick with the city's most vicious socialites, with his hand at the small of her back and his eyes daring anyone to glance sideways. He put her at his right hand at family dinners. He learned the way she liked her coffee and the fact that she flinched at raised voices, and he began speaking more softly in his own house, permanently, without ever mentioning it. He had a wardrobe made for her in colors she had never been brave enough to wear, and when she stood frozen before the mirror in deep emerald silk, apologizing for how much of her there was, he met her eyes in the glass and said, You will take up every inch of this room, Fiamma, and you will do it without saying sorry once. And Thea, for the first time in her life, began to unfold, but the world she had walked into was not a kind one, and the more Roman claimed her in public, the more certain people decided she was a problem. The cruelty came, as it always does, wearing a beautiful face. At a family gathering, a sleek and vicious woman named Larissa Wexler, who had spent 2 years positioning herself to be the next Mrs. Draghi, cornered Thea near the terrace with an audience trailing behind her. Oh, sweetheart, Larissa cooed, loud enough for the room, her eyes traveling over Thea's curves with theatrical pity. Look at you in all that silk. Bless him, he's being so kind. She smiled like a blade. You do know what this is, don't you? Men like Roman get bored and want something comfortable for a season. Nobody looks at a big girl in a borrowed dress and sees a queen. Don't embarrass yourself when he's finished. The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees, and the old Thea would have folded, apologized, made herself small, and slipped away to cry in a bathroom. But something had changed in her. Over those weeks, something a man had put back that the world had spent 20 years removing. She lifted her chin, and she did not shrink. You're right that I'm wearing his money, she said, her quiet voice carrying with perfect calm. But you should know that I spent the last hour looking at the paintings in this house, Larissa. And the 2 your family donated to the foundation last spring are forgeries, competent ones. Not competent enough. She tilted her head. So let's both be honest about who's pretending to belong here. And Roman, who had crossed the room in silence, took Thea's hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles in front of the entire gathering, his dead eyes fixed on the other woman. You will apologize to her, he said quietly, and then you will remember, all of you, that this woman has an eye worth more than every asset in this room, and that when you speak to her, you speak to me. Larissa apologized and fled, and Roman bent to Thea's ear, his voice for her alone. Never again, Fiamma, he murmured, not in my world, and never in front of me. But across that room, a man who had smiled at Roman Draghi for 12 years watched the whole exchange with a cold, careful attention, because Thea Brennan had just said the word forgeries out loud in a house full of paintings, and that was the one word that could destroy him. The man was Bastian Kroll, Roman's consigliere, and he had a problem that was about to become fatal. For 2 years, Bastian had been moving the family's money through the one channel no one ever audited, which was art. A painting bought modestly, revalued by a friendly appraiser, sold on to a shell buyer for 20 times the price, the difference washed spotless. And better still, Bastian had been swapping the genuine works out of Roman's own inherited collection, selling the originals abroad and hanging superb forgeries in their place, skimming a fortune from a man who could not tell one brushstroke from another. It had been flawless for 2 years. And then Roman had hired the finest authenticator in the country to catalog that exact collection, and had proceeded to fall in love with her and had installed her permanently in the house with a lamp and a loupe and unlimited time. Bastien had watched her lean over a small dark portrait for 4 days running. He had heard her say to no one, "Oh, you're a liar," and he understood with perfect clarity that the soft, apologetic woman everyone in that house had underestimated was going to hang him inside a month. He smiled, thin and cold, and began, very quietly, to plan. It was the last mistake he would ever make as a free man. Thea found it 3 days later, and she found it the way she found everything, by refusing to let a small wrongness go. The portrait had been bothering her because the varnish was too even. Real varnish ages in the room. It hangs in unevenly, according to light and heat, and this varnish had aged the way varnish ages in a workshop, all at once, deliberately. She took it down. She examined the stretcher bars and found new nail holes beside old ones. She ran a solvent test in a corner the frame would hide, and found a modern white beneath the surface, a pigment that had not existed when this painting was supposedly made. And then, 'cause Thea Brennan was thorough in the way that only quiet, overlooked people ever learned to be, she went through the entire gallery, canvas by canvas, for 2 days. 9 paintings, 9 forgeries, all excellent, all hung in the last 2 years, all replacing originals now presumably in private collections, on 3 continents. She sat down on the floor of that gallery with her hands shaking because this was not a scam. This was somebody robbing Roman Draghi blind inside his own home, and there were exactly 4 people alive with the access to do it. She told him that night. She laid it all out on the long table, the solvent tests, the nail holes, the photographs, and Roman went very still and very cold. And then he did the thing that undid her completely. He believed her instantly. He did not ask her twice. He did not send for a second opinion. He simply looked at the evidence assembled by a woman the whole world had spent 20 years telling was not worth listening to, and said, who had access? 4 people, Thea said. And one of them signed every acquisition. Roman's jaw tightened. Bastien, he said, and then he took her face in his hands and said something she would think about for the rest of her life. If I move on him, and I am wrong, I lose the family. If I move, and I am right, he will know the moment I do. So I need you to be certain, Faima, and then I need you somewhere very safe, because a cornered man does not go after the boss. He goes after the thing the boss cannot lose. Neither of them realized that Bastien had already decided the same thing. The fortress went dark at 2:30. Thea woke to a silence so absolute it pressed against her skin, and every instinct a lifetime of watching from the edges had honed screamed that something was catastrophically wrong. The power was out. The generator stayed dead. Roman was gone. Drawn to the freight yard at midnight by an emergency she understood, now, had been a lie. And Thea, sitting up in the dark, knew with terrible certainty that whoever had come while he was away, and that they had come for her. She did not scream. She did not faint. She did not run blindly. She thought cold and clear, the way she always had over a damaged canvas. 2 floors below. A silenced weapon coughed and a body met the marble. Thea slid out of bed and moved. And here was the thing none of them had accounted for, because Thea Brennan had spent 5 weeks in that gallery wing and knew it better than any man in that house. She knew the conservation studio had a hard-wired line for the alarm company on its own circuit. She knew the old dumbwaiter shaft behind the storeroom because she had been using it to move canvases. And she knew the studio held 40 liters of solvent, 3 heat guns, and a UV lamp, which is not a weapon until a clever woman decides that it is. She reached the studio as boots hit the landing, found the hardwired handset by touch, and got one line out to the only number that mattered. Then she did something better than hide. She turned her own workshop into a trap. She poured solvent across the tile at the studio's only entrance, a wide, invisible slick in the dark. She wedged the heavy conservation trolley into the corridor's narrow point so that anyone coming for her had to come single file, and slowly. And then she waited in the black, behind the drying racks, with a UV lamp in one hand and her heart slamming. The first man through the door went down almost immediately, feet flying out from under him on the solvent, his weapon skittering into the dark. The second, following blind, tripped over him and cracked his head on the trolley. Thea did not stop. She had spent her whole life being underestimated, and she knew exactly what to do with the seconds it bought her. She kicked both weapons under the flat files and slipped into the dumbwaiter shaft and drew the panels shut behind her, and heard, above the cursing, the smooth, unhurried voice of the man who had been robbing Roman Draghi for 2 years. "Come out, Thea," Bastian said pleasantly to the dark. "You're a clever girl. Cleverer than anyone in this house ever bothered to notice, which I suppose is rather the tragedy of you." He stepped carefully around the solvent. "You found 9, didn't you? It was 11, actually. And you have surely worked out that the moment Roman sees your notes, I am a dead man. So you understand my position. Nothing personal. You simply have the wrong eyes for a house like this." He was 3 feet from the panel, and Thea, crouched in the dark with her whole body shaking, did the one thing he never expected. She spoke. "You should have checked the studio before you came for me, Bastian," she said. Silence. "Because every photograph, every solvent test, every acquisition document with your signature on it went out of this house 6 days ago," she continued, her voice steadier than she felt. "Copies with my authenticator's report, sealed and lodged, primed to reach Roman and every family on this coast the moment I stop confirming, I am alive. Kill me tonight, and you do not just lose the money. You expose yourself to the whole commission as the man who robbed his own boss and then murdered his boss's woman to hide it." Bastian's certainty flickered. He had not planned for the quiet one to be armed with anything but a loop. And in his half-second of hesitation, the front gates below exploded inward with the tortured shriek of an engine pushed past its limits. Roman had come home. Time seemed to fracture. Gunfire erupted below, brief and brutal and absolute, and Bastian spun toward the sound. And Thea, seizing the only moment she would ever get, drove the dumbwaiter panel open with her shoulder into the back of his knees. He went down hard into his own solvent slick, scrabbling for purchase he could not find, and she was already moving, kicking his weapon into the dark. And then the studio doors were thrown open, and Roman filled the doorway, soaked in rain, his suit ruined, his eyes wild and searching. Ciro, his loyal lieutenant, poured in behind him with 4 armed men, and the trap Bastian had spent 2 years building snapped shut around him instead. Roman had him by the throat against the wall before the man could speak, and his voice was a lethal whisper. 12 years, he said. You sat at my table for 12 years, and then you came into my house for her. Then he turned his head, and the murderous cold in his eyes dissolved into raw, naked fear, and he released Bastian to Ciro's men and crossed the room in 2 strides. His large hands moved frantically over Thea's arms, her face, her shoulders, checking for blood, for wounds, for any harm to what was his. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "Did he touch you? Look at me. Breathe." "I'm all right," Thea wept finally, letting the terror crash over her, her fingers twisting in his soaked lapels. "I mopped the floor with 40 liters of turpentine and let them do the rest." Roman let out a broken, disbelieving laugh into her hair, and then he framed her tear-streaked face in his trembling hands and looked at her the way no one in her whole overlooked life had ever looked at her. "You are magnificent," he breathed. "My own men missed him for 2 years, and you caught him with a lamp, and then you held my house alone." And then his voice cracked open entirely. "You stood against that wall 5 weeks ago and told me you were too big for me," he said hoarsely. "Fiamma, I have spent every day since, terrified that I am not nearly enough for you." Bastian Kroll, the man who had smiled at Roman for 12 years while stripping his walls bare, learned the price of underestimating them before the week was out. He let Thea lay the entire elegant crime before the commission. 11 forgeries, every falsified appraisal, every shell sale, every original track to a private collection across 3 continents by an authenticator whose word no auction house on earth would question. And when the 5 families had seen the proof, Roman looked at her. And Thea did not counsel death. "You do not need to make him a martyr," she said quietly. "You need to make him nothing." So they did it her way. They stripped Bastian of every hidden asset, recovered what could be recovered, and released his name and his forgeries to every auction house, dealer, and collector on 3 continents, so that the man who had prided himself on being the most elegant thief in the underworld became, permanently and publicly, a known fraud whose touch poisoned everything he had ever handled. He was left alive, bankrupt, disgraced, unable to sell so much as a postcard, a fate the old man agreed was far crueler than any quick and merciful bullet. And Larissa Wexler, who had told Thea that nobody looks at a big girl and sees a queen, watched the 2 forged donations Thea had spotted in 10 minutes unravel her family's standing in a single season, and spent the rest of her life at the far end of every table Thea sat at the head of. As for Corin, the man who had kept Thea a secret for 2 years and told her he could not picture her on his arm, he opened a newspaper one morning to a photograph of the woman he had discarded on the arm of Roman Draghi at a museum opening, radiant in emerald silk, being introduced to the entire city by name. Thea never contacted him. She simply stopped thinking about him at all, which was the only revenge that had ever really mattered. Months later, on a bright morning washed gold with new sun, Thea Brennan stood in a gallery she now curated for a family whose collection had never been cleaner, and she did not fold herself away anymore. She wore rich color tailored to celebrate every curve she had spent 29 years apologizing for. She did not say sorry when someone bumped into her. She took up exactly as much room as she wanted. Roman came in and stopped, simply to watch her. "You're staring, Mr. Draghi," she said, a smile in her voice. "I will never stop staring at you," he said, crossing the room and taking her hands. "Do you know what I understood the night you pushed me away and said that sentence?" he asked quietly. "I understood that somebody had spent 20 years teaching the most extraordinary woman I have ever met to apologize for the space she takes up, and that it was going to take me the rest of my life to undo it." He tilted her chin up, his dark eyes soft in a way the rest of the world would never see. "You told me you were too big for me, Fiamma. You were never too big. You were too much for every small person who ever tried to hold you. And I have spent every day since praying I am large enough to deserve you." Thea looked up at the man the whole city feared, a man who bowed to no one and yet bowed entirely to her. And for the first time in her life she believed she was exactly enough. She had spent 29 years being wanted in private and chosen by nobody, folding herself smaller to fit rooms that had never wanted her, and she had proven every last one of them wrong, because she alone had ever offered a ruthless man something real, and because the eye the world had dismissed as a technician's trick had saved his empire and his life. She had whispered that she was too big for someone like him, and he had pinned her gently to the wall and said, "Try me," and then spent every day afterward proving that the only thing about her that had ever been too big was the way the world had underestimated her. If Thea and Roman's story of hidden worth, fierce devotion, and hard-won vindication moved you, if your heart stopped when she whispered that she was too big for him, and he said, "Try me," then do us a small favor before you go. Smash that like button right now. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that the space you take up was never the problem. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another twist-filled tale of the overlooked soul who finally gets everything she deserves. And drop a comment below and tell us what was your favorite moment in Thea and Roman's story.